Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I got a great episode lined up for you because I got a great guest. I have Thomas Baker, the author of The Fall of the FBI, How a Once Great Agency Became a Threat to Democracy. And before I get to the guest, make sure you visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com. Sign up for the newsletter there. Also, share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. And if you like the content, make sure to leave a 5-star rating and take 30 seconds to write a review. With that out of the way, I want to welcome Thomas Baker, author of The Fall of the FBI, How a Once Great Agency Became a Threat to Democracy. Tom, how are you today?
I'm very good, Nicholas. Glad to be with you.
Well, you wrote a book and it categorizes the fall of the FBI, how people have lost faith in the institution, how this was a long time coming. And you point to two things, really, September 11th and the Mueller-Comey era. So can you just explain to the audience briefly about where the decline started, how long you were with the FBI, and what you saw on the inside?
Well, I identify, personally, just to introduce myself, I was 33 years in the FBI in a variety of positions. And since retiring from the Bureau, I've continued to be engaged with the FBI and with the criminal justice system in general. So I have my ear to the ground on this, so to speak. What I believe has happened to the FBI is a change in culture. The change in culture was begun by Bob Mueller when he was director. That's Bob Mueller of special counsel fame. And it was exacerbated by the poor leadership of James Comey.
Yeah, and looking at Mueller and Comey, when you look at their leadership, what particularly about it, what was the problem? Was it because a lot of times that they would put the FBI and the investigatory powers that they were granted under Homeland Security above things like the Constitution of the United States?
Well, in a nutshell, that's what happened to some extent. It began, and I identify this one key episode, it began when Mueller became director. Bob Mueller became the FBI director just 2 or 3 days before the September 11th attacks, which were on a Tuesday. The following Saturday morning, September 15th, Mueller was summoned to the presidential retreat in Camp David, Maryland, where then President George W. Bush was hunkered down with his key national security advisors. Mueller thought he was there to present a report of the FBI's investigation up to that point. In the 3.5 days that had elapsed between the attack on Tuesday and that Saturday morning, the FBI did what they do best: investigate. And they had identified all 19 hijackers, their financing, their travel, their associates, their connections going back to Al-Qaeda. And when Mueller was done presenting that report, expecting praise or thanks, and he has told us this on a number of occasions, George W. Bush just turned and looked to him and said, "I don't care about that. I just want to know how you're going to prevent the next one." Mueller left that encounter bound and determined to change the culture of the FBI. And that's the word he used, culture, from that of a law enforcement organization to an intelligence agency. That had a lot of unintended consequences and a lot of bad consequences.
And can you elaborate on some of the bad consequences that it had?
Well, essentially it's this, Nicholas. In a law enforcement agency, the mindset is such that you live and exist every day for when the day comes when you're going to have to raise your right hand in court before a judge or a jury and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to a set of facts. An intelligence agency doesn't deal in facts. They deal in estimates, intelligence estimates, they call it, which some of us would call best guesses. And
it's an art, not a science.
Yeah, and their underlying modus of operation on a daily basis is deceit and deception. It's a totally different mindset. It leads to totally different results and different attitudes.
And that's a big difference. So when you look at intelligence, the FBI morphed from investigating crimes, building evidence to use in cases and prosecuting those crimes, to essentially trying to predict, in a sense, of where the crime would occur, particularly terrorism. And that's what began this behemoth of an intel apparatus and only has expanded. Now, fast forward, you have Comey come in, and Comey, who thought he was a Boy Scout, I mean, the self-righteousness of that guy drives me nuts. He really thought that he was the golden child that, was better than everyone else. And he takes it even a step further, where he begins to look at presidential candidates. How did that change?
Well, that's right. And you described him and his personality, which did affect his leadership and did affect the Bureau, his holier than thou leadership. And yet he wound up actually, and he's documented this in his own books, trying to incriminate a president of the United States. Part of the change to an intelligence agency was a change in management style. Traditionally in the FBI, cases are run from the field. There's a case agent who's responsible for the case. He's directly supervised by a field supervisor looking over his shoulder. Then in the field office, there's a special agent in charge who again reviews what they're doing. So you have these layers of independent judgment and reflection. Mueller moved the investigation of the September 11th attacks into FBI headquarters. Now, a lot of the executives at the time told him that's not the way we do business. But he insisted on that. He wanted total control in headquarters. So in that investigation, which the FBI called Pent Bomb for Pentagon, Pennsylvania bombing, it was run out of FBI headquarters. It set a bad precedent. James Comey followed that in the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and then in the Russian collusion investigation, codenamed Crossfire Hurricane. So they eliminated the traditional layers of review and independent judgment. And you wound up with a situation where in the Russian collusion matter, you had this character, a deputy assistant director, Peter Strzok, making the decision to open the case, writing the opening communication, signing out, that is approving the opening communication. And that was all on a Sunday, July 31st, 2016. And the following day, getting on an airplane and going to London, England to personally conduct the first interview in the investigation. No independent judgment, no levels of review. It was bound to end badly.
Yeah, you think they would have thought about that, but obviously they didn't care. And that's my biggest concern. And I'll get to that in a minute. But when we look at it, when you take the power away from the field offices who are more close to the actual action that exists, they're closer to the people, and they're inoculated from the corruption within the DC area, that's a pretty big deal, right?
It's a tremendous big deal. It was a departure from how things are traditionally done, and it left all the decisions in the hands of a few people who not only made the decisions, but actually conducted the investigation.
And there was no accountability. So we now know, obviously, Russia collusion was all a scam. There was no real basis for the investigation, should never have started in the first place. You would think that would have opened some eyes in the FBI. Now, obviously, Comey got fired by the former president. You had McCabe resign, Strzok left, but nobody was ever held accountable for the abuse of power. And in fact, the abuses of power have gotten worse. So we're just learning about the Catholic memo. And just to speak about that briefly, and I think this is why people are losing faith in the institution. Initially, Director Wray testified that the Catholic memo was a product that came out of Virginia, that, it's something when he found out about it, he was upset and he pulled it, and he made sure that this was never going to be something that was going to become actionable. Well, now we get evidence that it wasn't just the Virginia field office. It was also a field office in Los Angeles. There was also a field office, I believe, in Oregon, Portland, maybe. And so it was much more widespread, targeting traditional Catholics and essentially making them out to be violent extremists, or at least have a tendency to violent extremism. So when you saw that, why is nobody ever held accountable in the FBI?
Well, you've touched on, Nicholas, there several key points. One key point is, in this free-ranging intelligence world, you don't have the guidelines of the Constitution that were drilled into so many special agents in past decades. So you can have intelligence analysts sitting around and coming up with these crackpot, and there's no other word for it, crackpot idea. And what's really
why is that? I just want to interrupt you for 1 second. Why is that? So you had intelligence analysts prior to this day and age that had certain rules drilled into them, especially when it comes to religion, because it is such a touchy subject. And they were drilled into making sure that the optics, you always paid attention to optics, but number two, to make sure that there was nothing nefarious, that it didn't appear that you were abusing power or targeting innocent people. What changed in the intelligence analysts where they weren't receiving these types of lessons, where they weren't looking at something where there was no real evidence to even start a basis of the investigation?
Nicholas, it's all part of a sea change after September 11th. Rules, regulations, as well as laws were amended and amended again and again in the years since then, which allowed these abuses to happen. The position inside the FBI of intelligence analyst has gained an importance. I have current agents coming to me and telling me that the intelligence agents are the intelligence analysts, are driving the agenda. These are people who, by the definition of their job, they don't go out of the office. They're not in contact with the public. Special agents.
And they operate in theory.
Yes, and special agents who do get out, they're trained, and they should be trained, and they should continue to maintain this training. They're inculcated with a concern for the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights, but particularly the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment. So they're sensitive when they're interviewing an American citizen to advise them of their rights. They're sensitive to that. They're sensitive to when you're searching somebody's home with a search warrant to color within the lines. And this is all part and parcel of a respect for the Constitution, a grounding, a training in the Constitution. But these other people, now that it's morphed into an intelligence agency, they're figuratively sitting around and thinking up things. They view the entire American population as potential enemies. And Nicholas, this is a very scary thing. We all in the FBI and in government, we've always had acronyms, abbreviation.
The government's notorious for the acronyms.
Right. I mean, even now, a lot of people can't even say the word Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Everything's FISA, FISA, FISA. Well, they actually came up with an acronym, RTC, Radical Traditional Catholics. In the FBI in the past, agents would have been terrified of inventing an acronym like that about any mainstream or any religious group, because the freedom of religion is right up there in the front of the First Amendment, along with freedom of speech. And that's something we have to be very careful about. But that concern has slipped to the sides in this intelligence mindset.
It certainly has, and it's not just with Catholics. We even see it down to the school board, right? So you have the National School Board Association in collusion with the Department of Education talking about threats, and so they write a letter encouraging the DOJ to investigate and to start investigating parents under the Patriot Act. Merrick Garland comes out a few days later and he authorizes these investigations. It really is ridiculous. Now, I want to make it clear, nobody takes threats lightly. You have to investigate threats to make sure that they're not serious. And anyone that is threatening any official out there needs to be arrested. We have plenty of laws on the books at the local level, the state level, and even the federal level. So if there are threats, we need to tackle that. And there's plenty of capabilities that law enforcement has that they can handle it. But this is a local level matter. It's not up to the FBI and the DOJ to get involved in this issue, and I want to zero in on this. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back, and we're going to talk about how the school board creates a chilling effect because it's targeting ordinary people. Hang tight. We'll be right back. Listen up, P.A.S. report audience. Experts say that China is hoarding a massive amount of food. They're soon going to have over 2/3 of the globe's corn reserves, over half its rice reserves, and over half its wheat reserves. But when asked about it, China lies. And one expert says that they, of course, will never admit to doing something like that. Well, what does China know that we don't? When it comes to the global food shortages, China is the canary in the coal mine. And you have to understand, China is the world's #1 food importer. They rely on the rest of the world to keep their people fed, so they can't afford to mess up. There'll be riots, civil panic, or even worse, when over 1 billion people can't eat, it's going to create a crisis for them. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for Americans like me and you? food shortages. That's why it's a smart idea to stock up on a kit of the best-selling 4Patriot survival food. Create your own stockpile of the best-selling 4Patriot survival food kits. It's hand-packed in the United States. The kits are compact, stack easily. They have different delicious breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and I can attest to that because I use 4Patriots, and their 5-star reviews on the website rave about the flavor and taste. Right now, you can get 10% off your first purchase of 4Patriot survival food by typing in the code P.A.S. at checkout. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase of 4Patriot survival food. That's 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, we were talking about Merrick Garland targeting ordinary parents in the school boards because apparently he and the DOJ, they don't like parents going out there and raising their voices about the concerns they have of what their children are learning. It's ordinary people. They create an entire threat tag system in order to monitor these school boards. Can you explain to the audience what threat tagging is?
Well, it's a record-keeping system within the Bureau, within the DOJ. But the bottom line on that whole issue or controversy, Nicholas, is you started to hint at it. There's no role for the FBI and the federal government. Most policing, most law enforcement in the United States is still done by state and local police. And if there's a school board meeting in a county and somebody does get disruptive, which there really hasn't been all that much of that, if somebody does get disruptive, it's the role of the local police or the local sheriff's office to restore order if law enforcement is needed at all. Yeah. There's no need or role for the federal government to be involved.
Well, even Director Wray testified that there was absolutely no evidence he saw of any type of increased threats in school board meetings, yet he still created a threat tag system to sit there and look at this. He sent FBI agents to the parking lots of schools to take down license plates. And Christopher Wray has lied numerous times before Congress, and yet no accountability again. And so we're getting a recurring theme of no accountability. But what concerns me more is the fact that ordinary Americans are being viewed with suspicion. You just said a few moments ago that essentially a lot of members within the FBI are viewing the American people as the enemy. Why?
Well, that's the mentality in an intelligence agency, in a freewheeling intelligence agency. They go beyond the scope, and this memo, which is now turned up in several field offices about targeting Catholics, and Catholics are not Catholics shouldn't be the issue. The Protestants, Orthodox, Jews, nobody should be the issue because of their religion. It's absurd. And Chris Wray is a disappointment in that he keeps making excuses.
That's putting it mildly.
So much of this. And he keeps falling back on, and you mentioned it earlier when you started with the Russian collusion matter. The bad actors there, Comey, Strzok, McCabe, they've all out the door, and that's Chris Wray's answer for it. And when the Durham report documented how there was absolutely no justification for the investigation of the Trump presidential campaign, Christopher Wray and the FBI officially put out a statement saying, well, the people who did that are no longer with us. And every time something happens, it's the bad apples are no longer with us. And I wish they would stop and look at the underlying cultural problem, this loosening of everything since September 11th, which has led us into every single one of these examples you give.
And you're not the only retired FBI agent that believes that way. There's several that I've spoken to, some off the record, some on the record, that also feel that way, that the mission has just expanded too greatly and needs to be reeled in. The people with the power of oversight, Congress, absolutely does nothing. I mean, they were well aware of the Pfizer abuses in 2017. They saw what went on, and yet they still reauthorized Pfizer without making any significant changes to make sure power wasn't being abused. But as far as FBI agents go, I mean, we've seen a few whistleblowers come out. They've been targeted. They've been savaged, not only by the FBI itself, but by the media, by Democrats. And that is extremely concerning to me, that when you speak out against the FBI, they'll target their own. How concerning is that to you as someone that's retired from the FBI? Is there like a support group that exists for former FBI people to try and help out these agents?
Well, there is a society of former special agents. Unfortunately, the current leadership of that organization has adopted a stand that they just want to push back against any criticism of the Bureau. For the most part, and overwhelmingly, I would say, former agents like myself are very concerned about recent developments. I'm in touch. I recently was at a luncheon with a group of former agents. Everybody comes up to me and they share the same concerns. And what has been particularly validating a lot of the things I have in my book, I do book signings, not surprisingly, at Barnes and Noble and similar venues. And I'll be there, and people will come up to me, men and women, and identify themselves as being current FBI employees. And they'll tell me, Tom, thank you for doing this. And they'll say words to the effect, it's worse than you think. And I have
that's frightening.
People come up to me and say, they're the wife or the husband of an FBI agent, and they'll say something similar. So I'm getting this tremendous feedback. I'm getting a lot of people, just like you, I'm in touch with a lot of people that are pointing out things with specificity. One of the problems in China changed this culture and pointing out the cultural problems is what you said almost at the outset of our discussion, that a lot of this is an abuse of authority. Quite often, there is not a violation of the law. I know there's a lot of people out there and a lot of commentators who are saying somebody should go to jail for some of this stuff. With a few exceptions, though, it's not a violation of the law. It's an abuse of authority. The people who put on those FISA warrants, abusive FISA warrants on Carter Page, they had the authority to do that. The court had the authority to issue it.
But just to interrupt you for a moment, Kevin Kleinsmith actually manipulated a CIA email. So the CIA said Carter Page is an asset of ours. Kevin Kleinsmith of the FBI actually changed the email to say not. He added the word not an asset. And yet when he was prosecuted for this, he got probation, didn't lose his law license, didn't go to jail. He got probation. And so it's things like that, the illegality like that is truly stunning. And also, wouldn't it be illegal to lie to a FISA court? I mean, isn't that perjury?
Yes. If it's a direct lie, and there may have been direct lies, but and you're right, the Kleinsmith was a specific violation of the law, and thanks to John Durham, he was prosecuted for that. And there's one or two others, including. But most of it's an abuse of authority. For instance, in the FISA matter, in addition to the false information, which some people knew and some people suspected was false at the time from the Steele dossier that was used, there was also what we call exculpatory information from actually FBI undercover agents and cooperating witnesses who were run up against some of the characters that they were considering using FISA on. Carter Page, but also Papadopoulos and one or two others. And that exculpatory information was ignored in preparing the applications for the FISA warrant. Those are abuses of authority. And in the General Flynn subset of that investigation, General Flynn and other U.S. citizens, U.S. persons, were unmasked. The people who unmasked them, up to and including the man who's now the president, who was then the vice president, unmasked a lot of people in that, requested the unmasking, and they had the authority to do that. There's a set of officials in the government across several agencies that have that authority. But it was an abuse to promiscuously unmask Americans. And if I could take another half a minute and explain what this unmasking is. In counterintelligence, in investigations by the FBI, but also in the more voluminously in the work that's done by the CIA and the NSA overseas, monitoring communications, targeting the NSA and the CIA are supposed to only be targeting foreign entities. In the course of monitoring their conversations and digital communications, often Americans are discovered. Most of the time being totally innocent, just being in a business discussion with somebody. In any reporting, we're trained in its government rules and regulations that American's identity is to be masked. So in the communication that's prepared to be disseminated to other agencies, or something I was involved in for several years, disseminating cuts of these communications to our allies, the name of the American citizen is always masked. So you'll have a sentence or two, and then when the American's name comes up, and this includes American corporations and legal aliens as well. It's actually U.S. persons is the term of art that's used. You have brackets and just the bold letters in there, U.S. person. And our foreign allies and others who receive this information, they accept it like that. There's no need to unmask the American's identity. But people in the government have the authority to unmask. For instance, in the FBI, if we discover a communication going from a foreign attaché, let us say, to a businessman in Colorado asking about the price or the availability of certain commodities, within the FBI, we would unmask that American's name so that an agent could go and intelligently interview the U.S. citizen as to his conversation and his contacts with this foreign agent. So you have to have a legitimate reason to unmask people. Biden, all these other people in the government that unmasked all these people around General Flynn had no legitimate reason to unmask them. It was an abuse of authority. And that's what I mean by abuse. There are so many abuses that happened that are not illegal, but Congress should and could, this is something Congress could handle, create penalties for this promiscuous unmasking.
And I think something like that would go a long way, because if you start to criminalize these abuses, it introduces accountability, making it less likely that people are going to be abusing their power. So I want to take up that point when we get back from this quick break. P.A.S. report listeners, our government is out of control. Criminal tax hikes, hyperinflation, a full-blown recession, it's part of the grand plan. The billions of dollars Biden keeps sending to the corrupt government in Ukraine, the trillions in new taxes he wants to shove down your throat, the electronic banking system crash that resets everyone to zero, checking accounts, saving accounts, 401ks, IRAs, all of it, zero. But you don't have to be a victim. Protect your money and get up to $10,000 in free silver to do it when you call Goldco. Goldco's helped protect over $2 billion in gold and silver for people like you and me. They're offering you up to $10,000 in bonus silver when opening a qualified IRA account just for being a supporter of the P.A.S. report. So whether you want to protect 50 grand or $500,000 or more, this is your opportunity to protect yourself from our out-of-control government. Don't be a victim and call Goldco today. 855-656-0196, 855-656-0196, or go to goldco.com/PAS report. Before the break, we were talking about criminalizing the abuses of power that we're witnessing. And as I said, I think that will go a long way, because right now you have FBI, they end up retiring, they leave. There's no punishments. They get to keep their pensions. They go on to sit on these boards, particularly tech companies. You had James Baker serving as chief legal counsel and then being involved in the Hunter Biden scheme to censor Miranda Devine's report and the New York Post about the Hunter Biden laptop. Right now, we see a huge debate in this country. There's a lot of people that truly believe that the FBI is so thoroughly corrupt that we have to begin to dismantle it, that it should no longer exist as an agency. Then you have others who don't want to take it that far. They believe that the FBI could be saved through certain reforms. So where do you stand on this issue?
Well, I definitely am opposed to dismantling the FBI or breaking it up in any fashion, but it has to be held to the traditional high standard. A lot of the reforms are going to have to come from inside the FBI and the DOJ. And as we were just discussing, a lot of these are abuses. There is a role, though, for Congress. Another widespread abuse that came to light in the Russian collusion investigation, which has gotten very little attention, is this indirect targeting. And John Brennan, the director of the CIA, has bragged about using indirect targeting on U.S. citizens. And how that works simply, Nicholas, is this. The CIA and the NSA are forbidden to target, to investigate, to surveil, choose your words, U.S. persons. Now, but they do routinely come up with information, as I just described in the unmasking example, on U.S. persons. And if they come up with information on a U.S. person that indicates national security concerns or criminal activity, they're supposed to, and they do furnish that information to the FBI. But what Brennan explained and bragged about is their indirect targeting. If they have an American, anybody you want to think of a name, who they're interested in for political or other reasons, What Brennan says they do is they find out what foreigners he or she is in contact with. And the foreigner doesn't have to be from what you might traditionally think as a hostile state. It could be from an allied country or a neutral country. And the CIA can monitor those people too.
Well, the CIA got caught spying on sitting members of the United States Senate Intelligence Committee and their staffs, and no one did anything about it. You would think that the ones with power of oversight would have been like, wow, they were monitoring our communications. Maybe we should actually do something about this, but they didn't. So it seems like the bureaucracy gets to act with impunity.
Yes, and the term of art used is incidental collection, where they incidentally collect information on an American when they're targeting a foreigner. But Brennan described how they deliberately target a foreigner in contact with an American they're interested in. So it's nothing incidental about it. It's an abuse. There's an example of an abuse. And Congress can address that. And the other big thing Congress can address, and you mentioned it in passing, is the FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was created in 1978 to provide a legal framework for the secret surveillance of foreign agents in this country in order to gather intelligence on them, not to gather evidence for a crime. So there's a lower standard for a FISA warrant than, say, for a criminal warrant for electronic surveillance. And once that was passed in 1978, for a couple of decades, that's exactly what it was used for. It was only targeting foreigners to gather intelligence. And of course, the intelligence was then sent up the line to the decision makers in our government, mainly and ultimately the president. And it never saw the light of day. After September 11th, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was amended and amended and amended again, so that now it permits the surveillance of U.S. persons, including U.S. citizens. And we saw the striking example of that with Carter Page, where there were 4 warrants on this U.S. citizen. A very fundamental change Congress can make is restoring FISA to its original and very important purpose, only surveilling foreigners and only to gather intelligence on them, not to use it against Americans.
And that comes up for a vote in December, so they better get their butts in gear. And, you know, I don't have much faith in the institutions themselves reforming themselves, because at this point, they don't have the leadership to actually do that. So unfortunately, we have to place our faith in Congress, which is always very difficult to do. Tom, I really enjoyed the conversation, and I do want to have you back. The fall of the FBI, how once great agency became a threat to democracy. We're going to have links to the book up on the P.A.S. report. Tom, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you for putting the book up on your site. I appreciate it.
Not a problem at all. Thank you for your service. And I only hope that more people speak out like you do, because it's really important that Americans understand what's at stake. I mean, you know, the idea of the all-powerful government, it's here, and we need to push back against it. So I really appreciate you taking the time and speaking out. Everyone, check out PASreport.com, sign up for the newsletter there, and also make sure to like and subscribe to this podcast. And I'll be back next time on another great episode of the PAS Report podcast.
Nicholas, thank you for all the good you do.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.